Sorry I'm running late. I'm training for a big race. It's the 200-meter dash. Did you know this event was at the very first Olympic Games? That was in 776 BC, way back in the time of ancient Greece. Take a look at this map. Greece looks small and unimpressive, doesn't it? But on this little peninsula once stood a civilization unlike any that had come before. My name is Arizona Smith. As an archaeologist, I raced around the world searching for clues to our past. What's so cool about ancient Greece is that once you put all the clues together, you can see a really close connection between their ancient civilization and our modern one. For starters, ancient Greece was the birthplace of democracy, the same form of government we have today. Like us, the Greeks also believed that one individual could do great things, and many of them did. They were the first to write plays. They had great philosophers, scientists and mathematicians, artists and architects. They even studied history, learning about Assyria, Egypt, Babylonia, just like we do. The center of their civilization was the city of Athens. And in Athens, it was the Acropolis, a place where ancient history is still very much alive today. The Acropolis, which means high city in Greek, still towers over the city of Athens. In ancient times, it was the site of beautiful temples, statues, and monuments. Now it's filled with people busy preserving them. And millions of tourists. They come from all over the world just to see this really cool place. It may look like broken columns and piles of stones, but it's still impressive. Somehow, the grandeur of the Acropolis and its great temple, the Parthenon, has endured through thousands of years of history's changes. When it was built in the 5th century BC, the Parthenon was the temple of Athena, the patron goddess of Athens. The people brought gifts to the goddess, but few were allowed inside her temple. The statue of Athena was more than 30 feet high, made of wood, gold, and ivory by a sculptor named Phidias. Athena was dressed as the goddess of warfare, with a 6-foot-tall figure of Nike, the goddess of victory, in her hand. The statue of Athena has been gone for centuries, carried off to Constantinople by the Romans in the 5th century AD. Invaders like the Romans and the Ottoman Turks have occupied Athens for much of its history. The biggest tragedy came in 1687, when the Parthenon's roof and walls collapsed from an explosion. Believe it or not, the Turks had been using the old temple to store gunpowder. In ancient times, the Parthenon's frieze, the decorative band above the columns, was covered with sculpture. But there are only a few pieces left. Much of it was spirited away in 1803 by Lord Elgin, the British ambassador to the Ottoman Turkish Empire. With the Turks' permission, Elgin filled 22 ships with sculpture and sold it to the British government. The Parthenon sculptures came to be known as the Elgin Marbles, and they're still one of the most famous attractions in London's British Museum. The most recent, and perhaps the deadliest enemies to beset the Acropolis, are pollution and acid rain. The Greeks are involved in a huge project to preserve and stabilize their heritage. By the time it's completed, the preservation effort will have taken more than 30 years, twice as long as it took to build the Parthenon in the first place. But the preservation experts and workmen are being very careful, trying to piece together and restore the tens of thousands of fragments they've uncovered on the city's sacred hilltop. When the first Greek cities formed, no one town was more important than any other. In fact, each city was a bit like a separate country, a kind of city-state. In the early period, there may have been as many as 700 of them. Still, the Greeks thought of themselves as one people and spoke one language. By the middle of the 5th century BC, one city-state, Athens, had become the center of Greek civilization. It dominated trade, culture, learning, and politics. So when we talk about the ancient Greeks, we're usually really talking about Athens. Its only real competition came from the city of Sparta, a very different place, whose people were dedicated to warfare. The Athenians, on the other hand, were dedicated to democracy. Once every 10 days, they met in their assembly on a rocky hillside near the Acropolis. The meetings were enormous. You needed at least 6,000 citizens in order to vote. All citizens over the age of 20 could attend and speak their minds. Of course, to be a citizen, first you had to be a man. Second, both your parents had to be Athenian. That eliminated a lot of people. Once you took out the slaves, the foreigners, and the women, only 1 out of 7 people in Athens was eligible to vote.
If you were an Athenian citizen, it was your duty to attend assembly meetings. If you played hooky, you'd expect to be pursued by a slave carrying a rope dipped in red paint. If he caught you, it was all over. He would smear the paint on you, a sign of shame. And then everyone would know that you missed the assembly meeting. And to make it even worse, you'd sometimes have to pay a fine too.
Sounds like the Athenians took voting a lot more seriously than Americans do. And in an age of almost constant warfare, they had to defend their democracy many times. At the beginning of the 5th century BC, the vast Persian Empire to the east dominated much of the Greek-speaking world. But the Persians made a big mistake when they attacked the Greeks in 490 BC. The Athenian soldiers led the defense of their homeland well. When the Persians attacked again 10 years later, other city-states joined with Athens to defeat the enemy. Their success prompted the states to form an alliance called the Delian League. Athens became rich as money from the other states in the league flowed into the city. When the great general Pericles became the leader of Athens around 460 BC, the city-state entered its golden age. Pericles decided to use some of Athens' new riches to rebuild the Acropolis, which had been destroyed by the Persians. He was the one responsible for the Parthenon and the other great buildings on the city's hilltop.
When the Greeks heard the Persians speak, they thought their language sounded like nonsense syllables, like bar, 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 bar. So they came up with the word barbaros, or barbarian, as we say, to describe anyone who is not like them. My little brother is a barbarian.
In the history of the world, it's hard to find better architects than the Greeks. They were masters of the art of proportion, using mathematics to ensure that all parts of a building were in harmony with each other. Temples like the Parthenon were built to make every line appear straight to the eye. Greek architects used some pretty clever tricks. For example, they made each column widest at its base, becoming slightly narrower as it went up. This makes them look straight from a distance. They also made the columns lean slightly inward to appear more impressive and solid. Here's a neat clue for all you detectives. At the ruins of Olympia, you can see how Greek columns were made. These rings of marble were attached to each other by plugs of cypress wood.
Even in their ruined state, the beautifully carved details of the buildings are impressive. Imagine them in ancient times, when many of the decorations and sculptures were brightly painted. Public buildings in many parts of the world today owe a great debt to the ancient Greeks. In Washington, D.C., many of our best-known buildings are based on the Greek style.
Hi, Steph. What you looking at there? Stephanie is our detective in training.
These are some pots from ancient Greece. This one looks like some men are running. Could it be the Olympics?
You are a good detective, Stephanie. This pot was probably made for a winner in the Olympic Games. You know, Greek pottery gives such great clues to archaeologists because so many of them are decorated not only with the adventures of their heroes and gods, but with details from everyday life.
They're so beautiful.
Well, the Greeks were famous for their workmanship. Greece was the leading producer and exporter of ceramic ware throughout the Mediterranean.
But how come most of them are red and black?
The kind of clay that was available to the Greeks was a reddish terracotta. And then they developed mostly two styles of decoration, black figure and red figure.
Well, that pot looks like some women are dancing.
You're right, it's probably a ritual sacred to some god. The gods were really the center of Greek life. Games, theatrical events, processions were all dedicated to one god or another. And the Greeks seemed to pray everywhere, but particularly at places they thought were sacred to the gods, like caves or mountaintops. One of the most sacred places in Greece was Delphi.
To the ancient Greeks, the sanctuary at Delphi was the center of the earth, dedicated to Apollo, god of prophecy and light. The Greeks would bring their problems here to ask the god for advice. They would enter the sanctuary to meet a priestess who was believed to act as an oracle, speaking for the god. She would drink from a sacred spring and eat bay leaves from Apollo's tree. Historians think that she might have chewed special drugs to cause her to go into a trance. Anyway, her answers were usually pretty confusing and had to be interpreted by priests.
And this is how the Greeks solved their problems?
Well, this could actually be pretty effective. Since people came from all over Greece to consult the oracle, the priests had pretty up-to-date information about what was going on throughout the region. So what the oracle, or the priests, had to say could actually be right on the mark.
Sounds like the priests are reporters. Only the news came to them.
You're exactly right.
We can also thank the Greeks for giving us the theater. In the 6th century BC, the most important god in Athens, besides Athena, was Dionysus, the god of wine. Every spring, a festival was held near the Acropolis in his honor. Dancers and singers would act out stories about the gods and goddesses. Later, the Greeks would go on and write great tragedies and comedies we still enjoy today. But in ancient Greece, they performed them differently. The actors would chant their lines, often in a chorus, and the men played all the parts, even the women's parts. They wore brightly colored masks so everyone would know who they were supposed to be.
This place may look pretty barren now, but in the 5th century BC, it was the heart of Athens. It's called the Agora. Once it was filled with government buildings, workshops for pottery making and other crafts, jugglers and dancers, and open stalls where the men did the shopping. The Athenians were active traders, so there were goods from many parts of the world. The market probably looked a lot like this one in Athens today. Were you surprised when I said men did the shopping? Well, in ancient Greece, wives tended to stay home to look after the children, while the men led more public lives. Wealthy Greek men would often spend their evenings at parties called symposia, where they would drink wine and exchange ideas about politics and philosophy. One of the great speakers of the time was Socrates, who challenged the men to question the beliefs they took for granted. We now call him the first great philosopher. But for most of the Greeks, life was hard work. The soil was poor and rocky. The farmers grew olives for olive oil and grapes for wine, two main exports. Goats were useful because they required only rough grazing ground, and yet they provided milk, cheese, and wool. Women wove the woolen cloth into clothing for the family. The ancient Greeks ate mainly fish, fruits, and vegetables. They also ate plenty of bread and cheese and drank wine. They even ate bread dipped in wine for breakfast.
Did you know we got the word geometry from the Greeks? And the words chemistry, biology, physics, arithmetic, and mathematics. Sounds like they invented an awful lot of what we learn at school, or at least the names of the subjects.
Ancient Greece may have been an advanced civilization, but when you see the difference in how they treated boys and girls and men and women, they seem a lot closer to the Stone Age than to us.
Boys would memorize long parts of the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer, the most important writer for the Greeks.
Girls weren't considered worthy of a formal education.
The boys would study science, math, literature, geography, and history. They wrote by scratching onto tablets coated with wax.
I wonder if the homework melted on a hot day.
Very funny. See, music was also important to the Greeks. The boys would sing poetry. You want to hear?
No way. Girls could learn to play the flute. They could even take dance lessons. And one popular dance, they would imitate the movements of a bear. Finally, something that sounds like fun.
Athletics was just as important to the Greeks as education. The boys would run, throw the discus, javelin, and wrestle.
Well, then Sparta girls were trained as athletes too. But guess why? So they could have healthy babies. Can you believe that?
Hey, Spartan boys didn't have it any better. When they were only 7 years old, they went to live in army barracks to train to become soldiers.
Well, that is pretty tough. But still, girls had to get married when they were 13 or 14. And often the husbands more than twice their age. That wasn't true love. You got married to have a baby. Hopefully a boy, of course.
Yeah, I guess you're right. Girls weren't treated very fairly in ancient Greece.
Maybe that's why the civilization finally collapsed.
Every 4 years, people from all over the Greek-speaking world would come here, to Olympia. I'll bet you can guess why. Yep, this is where the Olympics began, way back in 776 BC. But to the Greeks, the games were primarily a religious festival. They built great temples and altars here. The games were so sacred that wars between states were stopped when the Olympics rolled around. Participation in the games was open to all free Greek men, but training was expensive, and you had to train for 10 months, plus an additional 30 days at Olympia. All this for a crown of laurel leaves, and the glory of winning at the Olympics. Before competing, the athletes would oil their bodies, rubbing them down with sand and ashes. In ancient Greece, men were expected to compete in the nude, so women weren't even allowed to watch the games. The foot race was the most popular event. Games were held regularly at other places within the Greek world too, including Delphi and Athens. Like athletes in our world today, the winners at the Greek Games became great celebrities, honored with money, gifts, and sometimes even food for life.
As you now know, the ancient Greeks enjoyed many of the same things we do today: sports, theater, art, literature. But for them, the good times did not last. In 431 BC, the rivalry between Athens and Sparta erupted into war. This was only the beginning of their troubles. A year later, a terrible plague descended upon Athens. People flocked to the Parthenon and the other temples to pray and then to die. Even the great Pericles was lost. Without his leadership, the war with Sparta lasted for 30 long years, ending with the defeat of Athens. The Greek city-states were weakened and vulnerable. To the north, the ambitious king of Macedon, Philip II, took advantage of the situation, and by 338 BC, he was master of all of Greece. His son, Alexander the Great, ruled an empire which stretched from the Adriatic Sea all the way into India. But though Alexander put an end to Greek democracy, he spread Greek customs and knowledge throughout his vast empire. When the Romans gained mastery of the Mediterranean world several hundred years later, they also embraced Greek culture and ensured its lasting influence. The ancient Athenians are so important to us because they were the first to believe that all citizens should have a say in their government. They believed that individuals had the power and ability to think and create great things. As a result, their achievements in science, literature, philosophy, and the arts continue to influence us today. When you take a look at all of the clues, all of the evidence on the table, I think you'll agree that we owe a lot to ancient Greece. Which reminds me, I've got that race still to run. Oh, don't worry, I'm not going to run naked like the ancient Greeks. See ya.